click subscribe now. It's safer that way, because what I'm about to tell you might make you question everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. This is a true story. For safety reasons, we've changed the names of the location and those involved. My name is Father Frank, and I've been performing exorcisms for over 30 years. I've seen things that would make most people lose their faith entirely. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered in the small town of Millbrook, nestled deep in the mountains of rural America. This isn't just another case of demonic possession. This is about something far more terrifying, something that lurks in the shadows of ordinary family life, waiting, watching, feeding on obsession and dark rituals that should never have been performed. I'm talking about a grandmother who everyone loved, a pillar of the community, who behind closed doors practiced witchcraft so dark, so twisted, that it cost an innocent woman her life and bound a man's soul for decades. This is about forbidden love turned into an obsession so powerful that it summoned forces from beyond our world. This is about a diary that revealed secrets buried for 50 years, secrets that involved blood rituals, spirit binding, and a pact that demanded payment in human life. When the family called me, they had no idea what they were dealing with. They thought their grandfather was simply grieving, that his depression was normal for a man who'd lost so much. But I knew better. I could feel it the moment I stepped into that house. The oppressive weight, the cold spots, the way shadows seemed to move on their own. Something evil had been invited into that home decades ago, and it never left. It had been feeding, growing stronger, waiting for the right moment to fully manifest. And that moment came when they opened her trunk, when they read her diary, when they spoke her darkest secrets aloud, and unknowingly completed a ritual that had been lying dormant for half a century. If you want to protect yourself and your family from spiritual attacks, hit that like button and share this video. You never know who might need this warning. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because the stories I share could save your life or the life of someone you love. I received the call on a Tuesday evening in late October. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Jennifer, 32 years old, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She kept saying something about her grandfather, about a diary, about things moving in the house, about feeling watched. I've learned over the years that when someone calls me in that state of panic, there's usually something genuinely dark at work. I told her I'd drive up to Millbrook first thing in the morning. The town was about 4 hours from my parish, deep in coal country, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and secrets get buried deep in the mountain soil. When I arrived at the old Victorian house on Maple Street, I immediately felt the heaviness in the air. It wasn't just the gray sky or the dead leaves swirling in the yard. There was a spiritual oppression hanging over that property like a thick fog. Jennifer met me at the door. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and she kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting something to appear behind her. Her mother Sarah was there too, along with her 2 aunts, Rebecca and Michelle. And then there was him, the grandfather, sitting in a worn leather chair by the window, staring out at nothing. His name was William, but everyone called him Bill. He was 83 years old, thin as a rail, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through you. The moment I saw him, I knew he was tormented by something beyond ordinary grief. Jennifer led me to the dining room where they had laid out everything they'd found. An old steamer trunk, the kind people used for long ocean voyages a century ago, sat open on the table. Inside were layers of the past, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, sepia-toned photographs of stern-faced people in Victorian dress, and objects that made my skin crawl the moment I saw them. There were small cloth pouches filled with dried herbs that smelled of decay, locks of hair tied with red thread, chicken bones arranged in specific patterns, and a black candle burned down to a stub with strange symbols carved into the wax. But the most disturbing item was the diary. It was bound in dark leather, worn smooth by years of handling, and when I picked it up, I felt a coldness spread through my fingers that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The diary belonged to Margaret, Bill's wife, who had passed away 2 years earlier at the age of 81. By all accounts, she had been a loving grandmother, active in the church, known for her charity work and her amazing cooking. She'd raised 3 daughters, helped run the family business, and had been married to Bill for 54 years. Everyone in Millbrook had attended her funeral. Everyone had spoken of what a wonderful woman she was, but the diary told a different story entirely. Sarah, Jennifer's mother, explained that they'd found the trunk while cleaning out the attic for an estate sale. It had been hidden behind old furniture, covered with moth-eaten blankets, as if Margaret had deliberately concealed it. At first, they thought it was just family memorabilia, old keepsakes from a bygone era. But when they started reading the diary, when they saw what Margaret had written in her own hand, everything they thought they knew about her shattered like glass. I opened the diary carefully, treating it like the dangerous object it was. The entries began in 1968, when Margaret was 24 years old. Her handwriting was beautiful, practiced, and elegant, the penmanship of someone educated in a time when such things mattered. But the words themselves were anything but beautiful. She wrote about meeting Bill when they were both young, living in this very town. She described her obsession with him in disturbing detail, how she would follow him through town, how she would steal small items that belonged to him, a button from his coat, a pencil he'd used, how she would sleep with these items under her pillow and whisper his name in the dark. But Bill was engaged to another woman, a girl named Catherine Hayes. Catherine came from the wealthiest family in Millbrook. Her father owned the coal mines that employed half the town. She was beautiful, educated, kind, everything a man could want in a wife, and Bill loved her deeply. They were planning a summer wedding, the kind of event the whole town was looking forward to, the kind of celebration that people would talk about for years. Margaret couldn't accept it. Her obsession had grown into something twisted, something dark. She wrote that she would rather see Bill dead than married to Catherine. She wrote that if she couldn't have him, no one would. And then she wrote about the ritual. I've seen a lot of dark magic in my years as an exorcist, but what Margaret described made even my blood run cold. She had sought out a woman who lived alone in a cabin deep in the woods, a woman the locals whispered about but never spoke of directly. They called her the Widow Blackwood, though no one knew if she'd ever actually been married. This woman practiced the old ways, the forbidden arts that had been brought over from the old country and hidden from the church, passed down in secret from mother to daughter through generations. Margaret visited her 3 times. The first visit was for a love-binding spell. She brought a photograph of Bill, a lock of his hair that she'd stolen from his barber, and 3 silver coins as payment. The widow Blackwood created a poppet, a doll made from cloth and stuffed with herbs, with Bill's hair sewn into its head. Margaret was instructed to sleep with this doll every night, to whisper Bill's name into it 100 times before sleep, and to anoint it with her own blood every new moon. The diary described how she followed these instructions religiously for 3 months, and at first it seemed to work. Bill became distant with Catherine. He would show up late for their dates, forget important occasions, seem distracted and confused. Catherine's family began to worry. The town began to gossip. But then something unexpected happened. Bill seemed to snap out of it. He returned to Catherine with renewed devotion, as if fighting against some invisible force. He proposed again, publicly this time, in the town square, declaring his love for her in front of everyone. They moved the wedding date up. They would marry within the month. Margaret was enraged. She wrote pages and pages describing her fury, her hatred, her absolute refusal to accept defeat. And so she returned to the widow Blackwood. This second visit was different, darker. The widow told her that a simple binding wouldn't work because Catherine and Bill's love was too strong, too pure. To break them apart permanently, something permanent had to be done. Someone had to be removed from the equation entirely. Margaret wrote that she understood what the widow meant immediately. She wasn't stupid. She knew what she was asking for. She was asking for death. The ritual the widow Blackwood described was ancient and terrible. It required a personal item from the victim, something worn close to the skin. It required grave dirt from 7 different graves, all of people who had died violently. It required the blood of a black cat killed during a new moon. And it required Margaret's own blood, given freely, binding her to the spell and its consequences forever. The diary described how Margaret obtained all of these items over the course of 2 weeks. She stole a silk scarf from Catherine's bedroom during a garden party. She visited 7 different cemeteries in surrounding towns, taking soil from the graves of people who had died in mining accidents, car crashes, a murder. She found a stray black cat, and I won't describe what she did to it. And on the night of the new moon, alone in her bedroom, she performed the ritual exactly as the widow had instructed. She wrote Catherine's full name on a piece of paper in her own blood. She buried the paper with the grave dirt, the scarf, and the other items in a small wooden box. She sealed the box with black wax, and then she buried the box at the base of a large oak tree that stood between her house and Catherine's family estate. The diary entry for that night ended with a single sentence that I'll never forget. By the dark moon and the old gods, let Catherine Hayes fall and never rise again. 3 weeks later, Catherine fell from the balcony of her family's mansion. It happened during a party celebrating her upcoming wedding. One moment she was standing there, laughing with friends, a glass of champagne in her hand. The next moment, witnesses said she seemed to sway, as if dizzy, and then she simply toppled over the railing. She fell 20 feet onto the stone patio below. Her neck broke instantly. She was dead before the first person reached her. The entire town went into mourning. The Hayes family was devastated. Bill, they said, became a ghost of himself. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, barely spoke. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, tears running down his face. The wedding flowers were used for the funeral instead. It was the saddest thing Millbrook had ever seen. And Margaret was there through it all, offering her condolences, bringing food to Bill's house, sitting with him in his grief. She wrote in her diary that she had to force herself not to smile. She had to remind herself to look sad. Inside, she was triumphant. She had won. Catherine was gone. Bill was free. And within a year, he would be hers. The diary described her calculated courtship. She was patient, playing the role of the concerned friend perfectly. She brought him meals. She listened to him talk about Catherine for hours, never showing jealousy, always sympathetic. She volunteered to help him sort through Catherine's belongings when he finally felt ready. And slowly, very slowly, she positioned herself as the person he depended on most. Bill was broken, shattered by grief, and Margaret was there to pick up the pieces and reshape them into what she wanted. 18 months after Catherine's death, Bill and Margaret were married in a small, quiet ceremony. Nothing like the grand celebration that would have been. No one in town thought it was strange. Everyone assumed Margaret had been a good friend who had helped Bill heal, and that love had grown from that friendship. They seemed happy enough. Bill smiled again, though it never quite reached his eyes. They bought this house on Maple Street. Margaret gave birth to 3 daughters over the next 6 years, and Catherine's fortune, since she had died without a will and Bill had been her legal fiancé, eventually made its way to him through a series of legal proceedings. The Hayes family contested it, but in the end the ball was on Bill's side. Margaret and Bill became one of the wealthier families in Millbrook. They owned property, invested in businesses, lived comfortably. By all outward appearances, it was a good marriage, a good life. But the diary revealed the truth. Margaret never felt guilty, not once. She wrote about her satisfaction, about how sweet it was to sleep in a bed with Catherine's inheritance, to wear jewelry that would have been Catherine's, to raise children in a house built with Catherine's money. She wrote about how Bill never knew, how he would mention Catherine's name sometimes, lost in memory, and Margaret would comfort him while secretly delighting in the fact that she had won. She had taken everything Catherine should have had and made it her own. And the most disturbing part was how she viewed it all as justified. In her mind, Bill had always been meant to be hers. Catherine had been the obstacle, the thief who had tried to steal what belonged to Margaret by right of her superior love. The ritual wasn't murder in her mind. It was simply correcting the universe's mistake. But there were hints that all was not well. Margaret wrote about nightmares that began shortly after Catherine's death. Dreams where Catherine would appear, her neck twisted at an impossible angle, her eyes black and accusing. Dreams where she was falling endlessly through darkness while a voice whispered her name. She wrote about seeing shadows move in her peripheral vision, about feeling watched in her own home. She tried to dismiss these things as guilt, as her conscience bothering her, but as the years went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. Objects would move on their own. She would hear footsteps when no one was there. The smell of Catherine's perfume would suddenly fill a room with no explanation. And Bill, poor Bill, seemed to deteriorate mentally as he aged. He became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours alone in the garage working on projects that never seemed to finish. He developed strange habits, like talking to himself in whispers, like collecting items that had no apparent purpose. And then there was the dog. About 15 years into their marriage, Bill found a stray puppy, a small terrier mix, and insisted on keeping her despite Margaret's objections. He named the dog Catherine. When Margaret demanded he choose a different name, he refused. It was the only time anyone could remember Bill standing up to her about anything. He doted on that dog obsessively. He talked to her constantly, told her things he never told Margaret, treated her with more affection than he showed his own wife. The dog lived for 19 years, an unusually long life for a dog that size. And when Catherine the dog finally died, Bill was inconsolable. He dug her grave himself in the backyard, marking it with a stone that he carved himself. He visited that grave every single day for the rest of his life. Margaret wrote in her diary that she knew why he'd named the dog Catherine. On some level, consciously or not, he knew. He knew what had been taken from him. He knew that something about Catherine's death hadn't been natural, and the dog was the closest he could come to having her back. The diary entries became more sporadic after that, sometimes years between them, but the ones that existed were increasingly disturbed. Margaret wrote about feeling something in the house with her, something that watched from the shadows. She wrote about waking up with scratches on her arms that she couldn't explain. She wrote about hearing Catherine's voice calling Bill's name in the middle of the night. She tried to perform cleansing rituals, tried to pray, though she admitted it felt hypocritical after what she'd done. Nothing worked. The presence, whatever it was, grew stronger over time. And then, about 10 years before her death, Margaret made a terrible mistake. She went back to the oak tree where she'd buried the box. She thought maybe if she dug it up, if she destroyed it, the hauntings would stop. But when she got there, the tree was dead. It had been alive and healthy for decades, but now it was a blackened, twisted thing, as if it had been struck by lightning or diseased from within. And at its base where she'd buried the box, the earth was sunken and dark, with nothing growing within a 6-foot radius. She tried to dig. She brought a shovel and started to unearth the box, but the deeper she dug, the colder it got. Her breath came out in clouds, despite it being a warm summer day. She heard whispers rising from the hole, words she couldn't quite make out, but that filled her with dread. And then she saw something that made her drop the shovel and run. A hand, pale and rotted, pushing up through the dirt from below, reaching for her. She never went back. She wrote that she sealed the diary and hid it away, along with all her other ritual items, and tried to forget. But forgetting proved impossible. Margaret died 2 years ago from a stroke. It was sudden and brutal. She'd been perfectly healthy one moment, laughing at something on television, and the next moment she'd collapsed. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was gone. The family mourned her as any family would mourn a beloved matriarch. They had no idea what she'd done, who she really was. And Bill continued his quiet existence, visiting that dog's grave every day, staring out windows at something no one else could see. When Jennifer and her mother and aunts found the diary and read it, their first reaction was disbelief. This couldn't be their grandmother. Their sweet, church-going grandmother couldn't have been involved in dark magic and murder. But the evidence was there in her own handwriting. The details were too specific, too disturbing to be fiction. And then they remembered all the strange things they'd noticed over the years but had dismissed. The way Margaret would never let anyone into certain rooms of the house. The way she would burn sage and herbs claiming it was just for the smell. The way she would sometimes talk to empty rooms, as if arguing with someone invisible. The way Bill seemed afraid of her, compliant in a way that suggested years of some unspoken understanding. They confronted Bill with the diary, showed him what Margaret had written, and his reaction confirmed everything. He didn't seem surprised. He just sat there, tears rolling down his weathered face, and nodded slowly. Then he spoke for the first time in weeks. He said he'd always known something wasn't right about Catherine's death. He said he'd had dreams where Catherine came to him, tried to warn him, but he could never remember the details when he woke up. He said he'd felt compelled to marry Margaret, as if he had no choice, as if invisible strings were pulling him along a path he didn't want to walk. He said he'd named the dog Catherine because it was the only way he could say her name out loud without Margaret getting angry. And he said that ever since Margaret's death, things in the house had gotten worse. That's when the real terror began. The family started experiencing phenomena that couldn't be explained. Doors would slam in empty rooms. They would hear footsteps on the stairs when everyone was accounted for. Cold spots would appear randomly throughout the house. Objects would be moved, sometimes thrown. Jennifer said she woke up one night to find all the pictures of Margaret in her bedroom turned face down. Rebecca said she saw a shadow figure standing at the foot of her bed watching her. Sarah said she heard two women's voices arguing in the attic, one that sounded like Margaret and another she didn't recognize. But the worst was what was happening to Bill. He started talking about being visited at night by Catherine. Not the dog, but the woman. He said she would stand at the foot of his bed, her head tilted at that terrible broken angle, and just stare at him. He said she was trying to tell him something, but he couldn't understand. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He would wander the house at all hours, having conversations with people who weren't there. The family was terrified. They'd tried having the house blessed by their local priest, but he'd left after 20 minutes, pale and shaking, and refused to come back. He'd told them they needed someone with more experience in these matters. That's when they found my name and called me. I spent the first day at the house just observing, documenting what I was experiencing. And make no mistake, there was definitely something there. I felt it immediately, a presence that was both sorrowful and vengeful, trapped between worlds and very, very angry. I interviewed each family member separately, had them tell me everything they'd experienced. I read through the diary completely, making notes of every ritual Margaret had described, every detail that might be relevant. And I examined the items from the trunk, using every protection prayer I knew, because some of those objects were definitely cursed. That night, I sat up in Bill's room. I wanted to see if Catherine would appear, as he claimed. I wore my vestments, carried my holy water and my blessed crucifix, and I waited. Bill sat in his chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. He seemed more alert than he had been, as if he knew something was going to happen. Around 2 in the morning, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. I could see my breath. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to become almost solid, and then she appeared. I've seen apparitions before, demonic manifestations that take various forms, but this was different. This was clearly the spirit of a human being, or what was left of one. She materialized slowly at the foot of Bill's bed, exactly as he'd described. A young woman in a white dress that would have been fashionable in the late 60s. beautiful, with long dark hair and delicate features, but her neck was bent at an unnatural angle, her head tilted grotesquely to one side, and her eyes were completely black, like holes into nothing. She looked at Bill with such sadness, such longing, that it broke my heart even as it terrified me. Bill stood up slowly, and I saw tears on his face. He reached out to her, whispered her name, Catherine, and she reached back, though they couldn't touch. There was some barrier between them, something keeping them apart. I began to pray not to banish her, but to help her communicate. I could sense she wasn't demonic. She was a human soul, traumatized and trapped, unable to move on because of what had been done to her. Through a series of questions that she answered with gestures and a presence that I could feel more than hear, I began to understand the full horror of what had happened. Catherine hadn't just died from the spell. Her soul had been bound by it, trapped in this house, forced to watch as Margaret took everything that should have been hers. For over 50 years, she'd been here, conscious and aware, witnessing her own erased existence. She'd tried to warn Bill, tried to make him understand, but the binding spell prevented her from communicating clearly. And Margaret had known. That's why she'd been haunted all those years. Catherine had been there, trying to break through, growing stronger as Margaret grew older and the spell weakened. When Margaret died, the spell's hold on Catherine had begun to break. That's why the activity had increased. Catherine was finally strong enough to manifest, to make herself known. But she still couldn't rest. She was still bound to this place, to Bill, by the ritual that had been performed. To free her, we would need to undo what Margaret had done, and that meant finding the box buried under the oak tree. The next morning, I gathered the family and explained what needed to be done. We would have to locate the tree, excavate the box, and destroy it properly through sacred ritual. Only then could Catherine's spirit be released and Bill be freed from the connection that had been forced upon him. Jennifer remembered an old oak tree on the property line between their land and what used to be the Hayes estate. It had died years ago and had been partially removed, but the stump remained. We drove out there, me and the 3 daughters and Bill. The old man insisted on coming, said he needed to be there. The place was exactly as Margaret had described in her diary. Dead earth surrounded the old stump, a circle of barren ground where nothing grew. You could feel the wrongness of the place, the spiritual corruption that had seeped into the soil itself. I prepared the area with blessed salt, created a protective circle, and we began to dig. We didn't have to go deep. Less than 2 feet down, we struck the wooden box. It was old, rotted, held together more by the evil inside it than by the wood itself. When we lifted it out, I could feel the malevolence radiating from it like heat from a furnace. I instructed everyone to step back. Using blessed gloves, I opened the box. Inside was exactly what Margaret had described. The scarf now nothing but moldy rags. The grave dirt, black and foul-smelling. The remains of the cat, just bones now. And the paper with Catherine's name written in blood that had turned black with age. But there was something else Margaret hadn't mentioned in her diary. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a photograph. It showed Catherine and Bill together, young and in love, both smiling at the camera. Someone had scratched out Catherine's face, gouged it so violently that the paper was torn through. Written on the back in Margaret's handwriting was a single sentence: mine forever. I showed Bill the photograph. He took it with shaking hands, touched Catherine's ruined face gently. He started to sob, 50 years of grief pouring out of him all at once. He said he remembered the day that photo was taken. It had been at the town fair, just a month before Catherine died. It was one of his favorite memories of her, and Margaret had stolen it, defiled it, used it in her curse. I knew what needed to be done. I prepared the ritual of unbinding, a ceremony that would release Catherine's spirit and sever the magical ties that had been forced upon Bill. It required burning the box and all its contents while performing specific prayers and invocations. It required Bill's participation, his willingness to let Catherine go and to forgive, if not Margaret, then at least himself for not seeing the truth sooner. As the sun began to set, we performed the ritual. I blessed the box and its contents with holy water. I anointed Bill with sacred oil, and then we set it all on fire. The box burned with flames that were wrong, too high and too cold, blue and green and colors that fire shouldn't be. Smoke rose in twisting patterns that seemed to form shapes, faces, reaching hands. I could hear screaming, though no one present was making a sound. It was coming from the fire itself, from the objects as they burned, from the spell as it died. Bill stood firm, holding the photograph of Catherine, speaking to her spirit that I could sense hovering near. He told her he was sorry. He told her he'd never forgotten her. He told her she could go now, that she didn't have to stay anymore. He told her he'd always loved her and always would. The fire burned for over an hour, far longer than it should have given the small amount of material. And then, suddenly, it went out all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was profound, and the air, which had been heavy and oppressive since I had arrived, suddenly felt lighter, clean. I could sense Catherine's presence one more time, just for a moment. Not the angry, trapped thing she'd become, but her true self, whole and at peace. She was standing next to Bill, and though I couldn't see her clearly anymore, I knew she was smiling. She touched his face, a gesture of farewell and forgiveness. And then she was gone, truly gone, moved on to wherever souls go when they're finally free. Bill collapsed. We caught him before he hit the ground. When he opened his eyes a moment later, they were clearer than they'd been in years. He looked around as if seeing the world for the first time. He said the weight was gone. The presence that had been with him his entire married life, pulling at him, keeping him chained to Margaret's will, was finally gone. We took him home. That night, the house was quiet. No footsteps, no cold spots, no shadows moving in peripheral vision. The oppression had lifted. Bill slept through the night for the first time in months, maybe years. When he woke up, he asked for breakfast and ate a full meal. He seemed, if not happy, then at least at peace. Over the next few weeks, he began to recover. He started talking more, engaging with his family. The haunted look left his eyes. He stopped visiting the dog's grave every day, though he still went occasionally, talking to Catherine the dog, as if she was an old friend who'd helped him through dark times. But the story doesn't end there, because 3 months after we destroyed the box, something else happened. Bill started having dreams again, but these were different. Not nightmares, but memories. Memories that didn't belong to him. He would wake up remembering things from Margaret's perspective, things she'd done that he couldn't possibly know about, conversations she'd had with the widow Blackwood. details of rituals she'd performed over the years to keep him bound to her. And gradually, he began to remember the day Catherine died. Not from his own perspective, but from Margaret's. He remembered her standing in the Hayes mansion that night, invisible in the shadows, watching the party. He remembered her whispering words in a language he didn't understand. He remembered her raising her hand and gesturing toward Catherine on the balcony. He remembered the look of satisfaction on her face as Catherine fell. These weren't visions or supernatural revelations. They were Margaret's actual memories, somehow transferred to Bill through their 54 years of magical binding. When the spell was broken, when Catherine's spirit was freed, all the secrets Margaret had kept locked away had flooded into Bill's mind. He knew everything now. Every lie she'd told, every manipulation she'd performed, every time she'd used magic to control him or their daughters or situations to her advantage. It was destroying him from the inside, not supernaturally, but psychologically. The weight of knowing he'd been a puppet for most of his adult life, that the woman he'd spent 54 years with had murdered his true love and enslaved his will, was too much to bear. The family called me back. I came immediately, fearing that whatever we'd banished had returned. But it wasn't that. The supernatural element was truly gone. This was something worse in a way. This was the human cost of dark magic, the price that victims pay even after they're freed. I sat with Bill for hours, listening to him pour out these terrible revelations. He told me things that made even my blood run cold, details of Margaret's magical practices that hadn't been in the diary. She'd performed rituals on their daughters when they were babies, binding spells meant to keep them close to her, dependent on her. She'd cursed at business rivals who'd crossed Bill, sending illness and misfortune their way. She'd even worked magic on the town itself, trying to increase the family's status and influence. Bill had been vaguely aware of some of this, had seen her performing what he thought were harmless folk remedies or superstitious rituals, but he'd never understood the extent of it, had never realized she was actively warping reality around them to serve her desires. And the worst part, the part that broke him completely, was realizing that some part of him had known all along. Deep down, beneath the magical compulsion, his true self had been screaming for decades, trying to break free, trying to warn himself. That's why he'd been depressed his entire married life. That's why he'd named the dog Catherine. That's why he'd visited a grave in the cemetery every year on the anniversary of Catherine's death, even though Margaret had forbidden him from doing so and he'd had to sneak away. His soul had known, even when his mind couldn't access the knowledge. I performed another ritual, not of exorcism, but of spiritual healing. I blessed Bill, anointed him, prayed over him for hours. I asked God to grant him peace, to help him integrate these terrible memories without being destroyed by them. I asked for Catherine's intercession, for her to help the man she'd loved find his way through this final darkness. And slowly, over days and weeks, Bill began to stabilize. He accepted what had happened to him. He grieved for the life he should have had, the children he might have had with Catherine, the decades stolen from him. But he also found gratitude for his daughters, who weren't to blame for how they'd been conceived. They were victims too, born from a twisted union, but innocent in themselves. One afternoon, about 6 months after the exorcism, Bill called me. He said he had something to show me. I drove back to Millbrook, to the house on Maple Street. Bill met me at the door, and I was shocked by how much healthier he looked. He'd gained weight, had color in his cheeks, moved with more energy. He was 84 years old, but looked younger than he had at 83. He led me to the backyard, to the place where he'd buried Catherine the dog. He'd erected a new headstone there, a beautiful carved piece that must have cost a considerable amount. It bore an inscription, Catherine Hayes, 1948 to 1969, the love of my life, forever in my heart, and Catherine, loyal friend who helped me remember. Below that was a quote from Corinthians about love never failing. Bill stood there looking at it, and I stood with him in respectful silence. After a while, he spoke. He said he was going to sell the house, move closer to Jennifer and her family. He said he couldn't live here anymore, surrounded by Margaret's things, in rooms where he'd been a prisoner. He was going to start over, spend his remaining years actually living instead of just existing. He asked me if I thought Catherine would approve. I told him I was certain she would. We stood there a while longer, and then Bill did something that surprised me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, an engagement ring with a diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight. He said it was the ring he'd given Catherine, that it had been returned to him by her family after she died. Margaret had wanted him to sell it, but he'd hidden it away, kept it secret all these years. Some part of him, the part that remembered who he really was, had refused to let it go. He said he was going to give it to Jennifer, to pass down through the family, but he wanted me to bless it first. He wanted any trace of Margaret's influence removed from it. He wanted it to be clean again, to represent what it was meant to represent, true love freely given. I blessed the ring, and as I did, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night we burned the box. A presence, just for a moment. Catherine was there one last time, watching over the man she'd loved. I could sense her approval, her gratitude, and I could sense her final farewell. Bill felt it too. He smiled, a genuine smile I'd never seen on his face before, and whispered goodbye into the afternoon air. That was 3 months ago. Bill sold the house and moved in with Jennifer's family. He's doing well, from what I hear. He's started going to a different church, one where no one knows about Margaret, where he can worship without the weight of her false piety surrounding him. He's made new friends. He's even started dating a widow from his new congregation, taking things slow, learning what it means to choose someone for himself. The house on Maple Street sold quickly, despite its history. The new owners are a young family with 2 kids. Jennifer warned them that there might be some strange energy in the place, but they laughed it off. So far, they haven't reported any problems. I think Catherine is truly gone, truly at peace. And Margaret, well, wherever her soul ended up, I pray it found the justice it deserved. I pray she understood, in the end, the enormity of what she'd done, but I don't know. I've learned in my years as an exorcist that truly evil people rarely repent, even in death. They justify their actions to the very end, convinced of their own righteousness. But here's the thing that haunts me, that keeps me up at night sometimes. The widow Blackwood, the woman who taught Margaret those dark rituals, who gave her the means to murder Catherine and enslave Bill. She's never been accounted for. I did some research after everything was settled. The cabin where she supposedly lived burned down in 1975, but no body was ever found. There are no records of her death, And when I asked some of the older residents of Millbrook about her, the few who were willing to talk, they said strange things. They said the widow Blackwood wasn't just one woman. They said it was a title passed down from one practitioner to another. They said that somewhere in those mountains, in some hidden cabin, there's still a woman who practices the old ways, who teaches the forbidden arts to those desperate or evil enough to seek her out. They said if you know where to look, if you know the signs to watch for, you can still find her. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my study, I think about Margaret's diary. I think about how easily she found the widow Blackwood, how willing the woman was to teach her rituals of binding and murder. And I wonder how many other Margarets have found her over the years. How many other desperate, obsessed people have sought her out and learned to twist love into possession, desire into death. How many other Catherines have fallen, their lives stolen by dark magic. How many other Bills are out there, living under compulsions they don't understand, their true selves buried beneath magical chains. The diocese has all of Margaret's diary now, locked away in their archives, along with the other cursed objects we recovered. The items from the trunk were properly destroyed according to the protocols for dealing with occult materials. The house has been blessed multiple times. As far as we can tell, there's no remaining supernatural presence there. But evil, real evil, doesn't need a supernatural component to continue existing. It lives in the human heart, in obsession and selfishness, and the willingness to harm others for personal gain. Margaret didn't need a demon to make her do what she did. She chose it herself, step by step, ritual by ritual, lie by lie. That's what I think about when people ask me about demonic possession, about evil spirits and dark forces. Yes, those things exist. Yes, I've seen them and fought them and cast them out. But the scariest thing I've ever encountered isn't a demon. It's what human beings are capable of doing to each other when they let obsession and selfishness override their conscience. Margaret lived a full life. She had everything she wanted, obtained through murder and dark magic. She raised her children, enjoyed her wealth, was respected in her community. She died peacefully in her living room, never facing earthly justice for what she did. She never confessed, never showed remorse, never tried to make amends. If there's a hell, I hope she's there. Not because I'm vindictive, but because there has to be justice somewhere. Catherine deserves that much. Bill deserves that much, but I don't know. I'm just a priest, just a man who tries to help people afflicted by spiritual darkness. I don't know all the mysteries of divine justice. What I do know is that evil like Margaret's leaves scars that last for generations. Her daughters will carry the knowledge of what their mother was for the rest of their lives. Her grandchildren will grow up knowing they're descended from a murderer. The town of Millbrook will whisper about it for decades. And Bill, even with all the healing he's experienced, will never get back the 50 years that were stolen from him. That's the real horror, not the ghosts or the curses or the rituals. The real horror is the casual cruelty, the willingness to destroy other people's lives and feel no remorse. And the fact that Margaret isn't unique. There are others like her out there right now, plotting and scheming, willing to do whatever it takes to get what they want. Maybe some of them will seek out the widow Blackwood or someone like her. Maybe some of them will find other ways, mundane ways, to achieve their evil goals. But they're out there, and the victims they create are out there too, living under compulsions they don't understand, mourning losses they can't explain, feeling watched and haunted and never knowing why. So I do what I can. I answer calls from desperate families. I perform exorcisms and cleansings. I pray for the living and the dead. I fight the darkness where I find it, with the tools God has given me. And I tell stories like this one, hoping that maybe someone will hear it and recognize the signs in their own life. Maybe someone will realize they're being manipulated or controlled. Maybe someone will understand that the grief they feel, the depression they suffer, isn't entirely their own, but has been imposed on them by another person's malice. Or maybe someone who's contemplating seeking power through dark means will hear this and understand the real cost, not just to their victims, but to themselves. Because Margaret got everything she wanted, but what did she really have? A husband who never truly loved her, who was with her only because magic forced him to be. Children who will now remember her with horror instead of love. A legacy of evil instead of good. And wherever her soul is now, she has to face the full weight of what she did, stripped of all the justifications and rationalizations she used in life. I wouldn't trade places with her for anything. I'd rather be Bill, victimized and traumatized, but ultimately freed and at peace, than Margaret, the victimizer carrying the eternal weight of her sins. That's what I've learned in 30 years of fighting evil. The victims can be healed. The perpetrators rarely can. So please, if you're hearing this story, protect yourselves and your families. Be aware that spiritual darkness is real, that there are people who practice harmful magic and are willing to use it. Be aware of the signs, the sudden personality changes in loved ones, the feelings of being watched or controlled, the patterns of misfortune that seem unnatural. And if you encounter these things, seek help. Don't try to handle it alone. Find a priest or minister experienced in deliverance ministry. Find someone who understands spiritual warfare and can help you fight back against the darkness. And one more thing, the most important thing. If you're someone who's considering seeking power through dark means, if you're obsessed with someone who doesn't love you back, if you're thinking that maybe a spell or ritual could give you what you want, please stop. Please understand that whatever you gain through such means will be poisoned from the start. You might get the person, but you won't get their love. Not really. You might get the wealth, but you won't get peace. You might get the power, but you'll lose yourself in the process. And in the end, you'll have to answer for what you've done, if not in this life, then in the next. It's not worth it. It's never worth it. I've seen the results too many times. I've comforted too many Bills, freed too many Catherines, witnessed too much unnecessary suffering caused by people who thought they could control others through dark arts. Choose love instead. Real love, the kind that respects free will and wants the best for the other person, even if it means letting them go. Choose to accept loss and grief as part of life rather than trying to cheat or control or force outcomes through supernatural means. Choose to live with integrity even when it's hard, even when your heart is breaking, because that's the only path to real peace, real happiness, real love. Everything else is just chains, whether you're the one binding or the one being bound. Both end up imprisoned. Both end up destroyed. I still pray for Bill every day. I pray for his continued healing, for joy in his remaining years, for the chance to experience true love if that's meant to be. I pray for Catherine. that she's at peace in whatever realm she now inhabits. I even pray for Margaret, though those prayers are harder. I pray that somehow, somewhere, she came to understand the horror of what she'd done and found genuine repentance. I don't know if such prayers do any good, but I offer them anyway. And I pray for the next victim, whoever and wherever they might be. The person right now sitting confused and depressed, not understanding why their life feels controlled by forces they can't see. The person who's just lost a loved one to an accident that wasn't really an accident. The person who's about to meet someone who seems perfect, but is actually a predator armed with dark knowledge. I pray that they find help before it's too late, that they find someone who believes them, who can see what's really happening, who has the tools to fight back, because this battle isn't over. It never is. As long as there are people willing to harm others for personal gain, as long as there are practitioners willing to teach forbidden arts, as long as there's evil in human hearts, there will be more stories like this one. More Margarets and more Catherines and more Bills, more families torn apart by dark magic, more lives destroyed by obsession and selfishness. But there will also be people like me, like the other exorcists and deliverance ministers fighting this battle every day. We're here, we're listening, we believe you, and we have the power, through God and through the tools He's given us, to break chains and free captives and bring light into darkness. So if you're suffering under spiritual oppression, don't give up hope. Help is available. Freedom is possible. You don't have to live under a curse forever. And if you're someone who's hurt others through dark means, it's not too late to stop. Not too late to confess, to make amends where possible, to turn away from evil and toward good. The spiritual laws that govern these things are clear. Repentance is always possible. Forgiveness is always available. But you have to choose it actively and honestly, not with empty words, but with genuine contrition and a real commitment to change. I've seen it happen, though rarely. I've seen practitioners of dark arts turn away from evil, seek God's forgiveness, and work to undo the harm they've caused. It's hard. It requires facing the full weight of what you've done. It requires making restitution even when it costs you everything. But it's possible, and it's the only path to peace for both the perpetrator and the victims. So that's my story, or rather that's Bill and Catherine and Margaret's story. I'm just the priest who helped untangle the threads at the end, who fought to bring some measure of justice and healing to a situation that had festered for over 50 years. I hope it helps someone. I hope it warns someone. I hope it comforts someone who's going through something similar and feeling alone. You're not alone. This is real, and help is available if you seek it. May God bless you and protect you from all evil, seen and unseen. May He grant you wisdom to recognize spiritual danger and courage to confront it. May He surround you with His love and keep you safe from those who would do you harm. And may He grant peace to all the Catherines of the world, all the innocent victims of dark magic and evil obsession. They deserve to be remembered, to be honored, to have their stories told, so that others might be saved from the same fate. This is Father Frank signing off. Stay safe out there. Stay vigilant. And remember, no matter how dark things get, there's always light available if you're willing to reach for it. Always. God be with you.